Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Rules podcast. I'm here with Paul Sullivan, a longtime New York Times columnist. Paul became a lead dad in 2013 when his wife started her own asset management firm. He spent the next 7 years as an undercover lead dad, not feeling he could be open about his role in his community, where most of the childcare seemed to be done by moms or paid caregivers, or at work. We didn't want his editors to think he was not 100% committed to his career. He became an expert at calendar Jenga to make it work. This all changed in 2020 when, without school or camp, being a lead dad and working full time became untenable. When he realized there was nothing to support fathers like him, he grew frustrated and then did some research. The sheer number of men in the lead dad role, about a third of all fathers today, shocked him. And you started a company to support lead dads.
That's correct, Doc. Yep, it's called the Company of Dads.
The Company of Dads. Yeah, so tell me about kind of your background growing up and this evolution to being the head of this organization with a great mission, really, supporting, providing community for lead dads that can really live in isolation.
You know, I should have known that talking to a psychiatrist, you were going to start at my childhood, right?
Start with a childhood, right?
That was a given. So, I grew up, lower middle class, and my goal in life was, never to live in the town where I grew up in, which I accomplished by going off to college and never returning. And my second goal was to write for the New York Times, which I started writing for the Times in 2006, and I became a columnist in 2008. But when you think if what you're getting at is sort of parental role models, my parents were divorced, and they weren't great at being married, and they're worse at being divorced. But my dad was a very like traditional 1980s dad. And by that I meant, he went to work, and after work he would go out with his friends and they'd have a couple drinks at the bar. And that's what they would do. A lot of my role modeling around fatherhood though came from my maternal grandfather, who was, retired at that point. We spent a lot of time together. He would take me around, he'd drive me, he would, taught me how to play golf, which is really important in my life, helped me get my first job. And so that was really the basis for it. But one thing I did know is that, when I grew up, if I ever had kids, I wanted to make sure I was very involved in their lives. But, as I think most young parents, find out when you have a child, you really don't know anything. You really don't know what you're getting into. You really don't know how to manage work and home. And for the most part, companies aren't really there to help you figure this out. They're there to help you they want you to come back to work and keep working. And they don't care if you have a kid or not. They're fine by them, but there's not really that infrastructure to sort of help you be a working parent, whether you're a father or a mother. And that's, one of the things behind the Company of Dads.
So what was that transition like for you personally when you took on the undercover lead dad role?
Well, I was lucky because at that point I was a columnist. And so that meant every week I wrote a column, so I knew when it was due. I worked on some bigger projects. I had already written one book at that point. I was working on a second book. Some of the bigger projects at the Times would take, a month or two to plan out. I gave a lot of keynote speeches, but keynote speeches are also planned out 4, 5, 6 months in advance. And so from a logistical point of view, it was very easy for me to organize my time. Far easier than had I been a regular deadline reporter, which I was when I met my wife, in 2004. That was challenging because things come up and you can't leave at a certain time. You don't really know when things are going to happen. So that was one thing that, from a work perspective, allowed me to balance things. The bigger issue was, coming to terms with being the only father at ballet. I had 2 daughters then, I have 3 daughters now. Being the only father at ballet, being the only father, on the playground, seeing other dads around in my town, but, never quite feeling like we could, talk to each other the way that you'll see moms just sort of naturally gravitate toward one another in the playground, naturally gravitate toward one another in a coffee shop. I don't really have that. And so that's, why I came up with the term undercover lead dad. And when we define the lead dad as the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his family. So we never say like primary parent because that, requires a secondary parent. But that undercover role, I didn't see any other guys like me in my town. And as you said in the intro, I didn't really want to put my hand up at the New York Times and say, hey, by the way, I'm also a lead dad, because I didn't want any of my editors to think that I was not fully committed to my job. Now, you as a psychiatrist, I mean, I can diagnose myself. This was my own personal insecurity around this. There were no editors at the time saying you can't do this, or I wasn't getting a message like that. It just was nobody really talked about it, and so since nobody talked about it, I wasn't going to talk.
So there was a um, change with being the only dad at these events. And there's also tends to be a difference between how men will socialize and how women will socialize, right?
Yeah, the famous, face to face for women and shoulder to shoulder, for men. But look, it was because I play golf. I had a lot of golf friends, and I'd usually find a day a week, in the nice weather to go and be with them. So I had ways to socialize, but what I didn't have was a way to sort of be honest about what I was doing. And for example, if after a round of golf, you're having a sandwich and a beer or an iced tea, whatever you're having. If the other guys were sort of complaining about their wives or complaining about what they had to do with their kids, I wasn't one to put my hand up and say, "Well, actually, I manage all that. I'm the one who figures out the birthday parties. I'm the one who figures out the schedules." I felt like if I kind of put my hands up, they'd look at me like, "What are you talking about, Sullivan? That's we just play golf with you. Why are you doing that?" Again, when I, came out, when I no longer was an undercover lead dad, I mean, I did it in the most public way. And that was in 2021 when I left the New York Times. I wrote a story about it. I wrote a story about why I was leaving the New York Times. And so suddenly everybody knew. And of course, what happened? Nobody cared. They either didn't care or they were really supportive about it. Had I known that, 8 or 9 years earlier, it would have made things a lot easier.
And what led to founding the company?
It was COVID. I was going through, and I was, like most people in COVID who were, fortunate enough to work from home. We had white collar jobs, fortunate enough to work from home. We were struggling with the logistics of life. There weren't any of those supports that we'd had before. There wasn't school, there wasn't camp, as you said, and also my dad plays a huge role in helping us with our kids. He's an amazing grandfather, but he survived stage 4 cancer. So in the beginning of COVID, he wasn't coming down to our house and hanging out because nobody knew how what if he got COVID? What would it be? We didn't know anything. And so we were adrift. Now, my wife is super stressed trying to figure out what's going to happen to her business. And I am super busy because this is like, the 2008 financial crisis all over again. Everybody's pitching in. It's all hands on deck. It's, you're trying to figure out the story and do meaningful work. And so I went online and I said, there has to be some organization that can help, dads like me. Anybody's, watching this, you can see my background. It's golf and books. There are plenty of ways to nerd out online about golf and books. When I went to find support groups for dads, I found lots of stuff for moms. Every flavor, shape, size of mom had a support group. I found lots of stuff for parents, but that was really geared toward moms. And when I looked at dads, it was dads in some sort of distress or dysfunction. They went through messy divorces. They drank too much. They had, bad relationships with their kids. All super important, but I think, why isn't there anything for men like me? I mean, golf is fun, but it's not important. Fatherhood can be fun, but it's super important. And so that sent me down the rabbit hole of, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Pew, US Census. It was quite easy to determine how many men in America were lead dads. And that 25 million number, that's a third of all fathers. And within that 25 million number, 23 million are working full time or part time. There are very few, like, quote unquote, stay at home dads in America. It's, just about 2 million men. So the majority of them were also juggling things just the way that women were juggling things. But the exception here, and this is where, I sometimes get pushback from women. The exception here was that men who put their hand up, it was seen as to be fully involved parents. It was seen as something strange or something not normal, something unusual. Now, we know all about the motherhood penalty. We know how women's wages and their economic advancement often get penalized after having children. But what we don't know is that a similar effect happens with men. So what do men do? They keep quiet about it. They don't say anything, and that leads to all kinds of problems down the road, both for men, but also for working moms and managers to create a more equitable workplace.
So how long has Working Dads been around?
Company of Dads has been around since 2022. We're talking in 2026, so we just hit the 4-year mark.
How many men are members of your group?
The newsletter goes out to over 10,000 people every week, but I mean, it's always a kind of a squishy number. Do you measure it by the number of followers on LinkedIn or Instagram? Do you measure it by that? I mean, one thing we've said from the beginning is, we don't check IDs at the door. We want to have an all are welcome, philosophy. And honestly, the way it's worked is that people interact in different ways. Some people sign up for the newsletter. Some people interact with what we do on LinkedIn or Instagram. Other people sign up for the monthly online meetups that we have. We'll sometimes get 75 or 80 people signed up for these meetups. A couple months ago, I sold a book, and that will come out in the spring of 27. And that's another way for people to interact. And it comes back, Doc, to what you said about the different ways that men interact. And that shoulder to shoulder, we're trying to allow men to get the information they want, get the community that they need in a way that is palatable to them. And so some people want to come to the monthly online meetup. Some people want to stay undercover. Maybe they want to just, read the newsletter. Maybe they're just going to want to read the book and get the information that way.
So they have a lot of choice in how they can get the data and get the support.
Yeah, we try to meet people where they are.
So besides the astonishing large number of lead dads out there, what other surprises have you had? What have you learned?
What other surprises? I mean, I think, that's a good question. What surprised me? I mean, there's been a good, I think it's interesting that when I do a lot of corporate talks, and when I do those corporate talks, it's almost entirely senior female executives who bring me in to do those talks. Now, there'll be a lot of men in the room, but it's never a guy who's part of the parenting ERG at XYZ company that reaches out to me. It's always a senior female executive. And, the more that I've done these talks and the more that I've talked to these executives who brought me in, the more that I've learned that these working moms want men to be lead dads, want them to be open about lead dads for their own sake, but also, as allyship for them so that, companies stop seeing, parenthood as somehow gendered. We say at the company of dads that there are only two things that women can do, that moms can do that fathers can't. And that is they can carry a child for 9 months and give birth. And two, if they so choose, they can breastfeed. Everything else has become gendered and these expectations around what women and men do. And so these senior female executives who bring me in to speak at their companies, to lead offsites, to lead, Q&As or training sessions, they do so because they see the value of all these men who are undercover in the companies coming out and being open about what they're doing, because it's good for them, but it's good for all the women in the workforce, because managers see that who they're really managing are not working moms, they're managing working parents. And those working parents are both moms and dads.
That's super interesting. And one of the things I hear about in my practice, like all the time, is how parenting has changed and how kids have changed. The rise of social media and the exponential changes that are happening in society, where we had 200,000 years to be hunter-gatherers and to have our brains wired a certain way. All of a sudden, the demands that our kids are facing uh, is something that our brains are not evolved for. So the challenges of raising kids, the challenges that the kids are facing, um, and how they're playing out in their development and in their schooling, mental health. It's just astonishing how much of a change and challenge that's become.
Yeah, that's more your area, Doc. But I'll say this: like, if I look back to my own childhood, I knew that I was poor, but I didn't know how poor I was. And the only people I had to compare myself to were other people in this sort of dilapidated mill town in Western Massachusetts. Now, kids can compare themselves to people all over the world. It's really easy to do that, and we have to work hard with kids to make sure they know that what they're seeing on Instagram, what they're seeing on Snapchat, is not necessarily true. I had the ability just to sort of, grow on my own. Now, my parents were both trying to figure it out as they were, figure out their own lives. So there wasn't anybody, and I was an only child. So there wasn't anybody, helicopter parenting me. But I think now many parents today see how high the stakes seem for their children. And they're more fixated on how can they help them compete? How can they help them get a leg up? I mean, there are smart people all over the world. When I was growing up in the 90s, we just weren't less aware of it because we weren't all so interconnected and wired together that we could see that your competition is not the kid sitting next to you in high school. Your competition is some kid that you don't know in the middle of the country, some kid you don't know on a different, not just different country, different continent. And so I think that has created a lot of anxiety for both, mothers and fathers.
It's a whole new world in terms of what lead dads, parents have to cope with their kids. And then another kind of development has become aging parents. And not only are you lead dad for the kids, but there's oftentimes additional demands for supporting an aging parent.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I look at my own dad and, I'm trying to, I go with him to some of his doctor's appointments. And so I've got to figure out in the next week, how I can take him to a doctor's appointment, still work, and then still be there for my wife and my kids. And it is 100% of a juggling act. I remember my mom, though, she was in this sandwich situation as well. I think it's just more prevalent now because people are just, I guess, not to be crude, but they're living longer and they're dying slower. So, and it's that combination. I remember my grandfather saying, his father, retired and like within 2 years was dead. And so there wasn't really any sort of sandwich generation for him. Now it's a good thing and a bad thing, but yeah, it means so much about what we're doing here. And when we talk about lead dads and working moms, it's really about caregivers in general. And so when I go into companies, I say, look, anything that we're talking about for parents can be applied to caregivers, because we know that 83% of married heterosexual couples, both the man and the woman work. But we know a bigger statistic is upwards of the high 90%, people will have some sort of caregiving emergency during their working life. And so anything you can do as a company to give people, we call them care days. We talk about people opting into care shifts, care confabs, all of these things allow people, employers to sort of, as I know your own work, to help employees manage burnout, because you want to be able to retain people, and a little bit of grace that you give them, a few policies wisely implemented can help people say, okay, this is a time that is a little stressful. Let me see if I, can get some grace from my company. And what we found is those companies that give that grace end up retaining those workers. And everybody wants to retain the top 30%, sure. But guess what? The bottom 60%, they're still doing important stuff. So by giving people a little bit of grace, you can allow them to stay in the workforce and allow them to still work at a high level. Because if you don't, there's just going to be juggling things. It's not like they're not going to take their dad to the doctor's appointment. It's not that they're not going to help their child who's home from school on a snow day. They're just going to be dishonest about it, and they're going to be trying to balance it instead of giving the full attention to the thing that needs that attention in the moment.
Yeah, so undercover caretakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's been interesting to me. Burnout was defined by the World Health Organization as an occupational syndrome. So they didn't and haven't expanded it to the caregiver, caretaker role. But that's one of the places that I hear it all the time. All these demands on individuals, on lead dads, really take a toll. People get emotionally and physically exhausted. There's a sense of bitterness and cynicism and attitude change, and you start to lose effectiveness.
Yeah, and it's something that needs to be addressed and managed because it's not economically viable for the majority of people in the United States to have one person not work. It's just not possible. It might have been in the 90s, but we're not going back to that. I mean, things are too expensive. Houses are too expensive. Childcare is a fortune. You need a way to pay for all of this. So if you have two people working, how do you figure out the best way to divide up the work? So one of the things we do at the Company of Dads, when it comes to the home, is we help couples have that conversation, because resentment is not something that just jumps into a relationship fully formed. Resentment is something that builds up over years and years and years and years. And in the terms of what we're talking about around caregiving and parenting and household responsibility, what happens is one person, historically the woman, the wife, the mom, one person does one extra thing. Then she does two extra things. And pretty soon she's doing five extra things. And fast forward, she's doing 20 extra things. Now, unless she married a sociopath, which we're gonna assume for the purpose of this conversation, she did not. Unless she married a sociopath, that husband doesn't really know that she's taking on all this stuff, or he may see some of it, but he's not really paying attention. So we really help at the Company Does to help people break down those barriers and have that conversation, because nothing good comes from resentment. But the only way you're going to know is to sit down and have a frank conversation. So one of the ways we do that is we have this thing called the paper test. And we said, find a Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon, have a cup of tea, have a glass of wine, whatever, when nobody is around but just you and your spouse. And we say, we want you to write down everything you do in one column, and then the other column, write down everything you think your spouse does. And then the other person do the same thing, everything you do, and then everything you think your spouse does. And the one thing we guarantee is that 100% of the time, those two lists will never match, ever. And so once you have those lists in front of you, that is the basis to start having a real conversation there. Not a heated argument, but a rational conversation, because most people will say, well, wow, I didn't know that you did those things, or I didn't know that that bothered you. And, I actually do more than you think I do. I do this, this, and this. And that starts that conversation, and that starts to reduce that resentment.
It's amazing what being kind of intentional with that sort of
Hmm.
dialogue is,
Yeah.
because otherwise you're tired at the end of the day, your weekends, you're running around doing things, and it's hard to carve out time to focus on the relationship, focus on the responsibilities, and to clear the air.
And to clear there, and not to just sort of retreat into your own, whatever your cave is, the thing that you want to do, and just retreat into whatever you're doing by yourself. And what happens, yeah, everyone needs some alone time now and again. I'm an only child. I certainly need alone time to sort of, recharge. But if you're not working on that relationship, if you're not working on it, month after month, it may not be hour after hour, month after month. What's going to happen? It's gonna deteriorate.
And Paul, have you noticed any trends in terms of burnout with lead dads, caretakers? Are you seeing anything in your communities around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's no different than it depends the level of lead debt. And I'm always very careful about this and saying that, there are 25 million men in the United States who are lead dads, but some of them want to remain undercover. Some of them don't want to talk about this. So the people that I'm talking to are the most open. There's the people who are coming to me. They want to be part of this community. They want to be deeply involved. So I don't want to say that my sample size is necessarily representative, but these are guys who want to do better. And what do they want to do? They often want to do better than their father did. And so they're really engaged in this, and they're coming to us to get that support and that validation, so that they're, combating that burnout. Look, kids can lead to, there's a lot to do. You see how you get burned out. If you spend your whole weekend, just catching up on all the tasks you didn't do during the week, you're not really recharging. But the guys who come to me, I equate it to somebody. I'm not much of a football fan, but maybe you're a Bills fan up there in Saratoga Springs. I don't know. But if somebody who likes the Buffalo Bills, if they go into a restaurant in California and they see somebody wearing a Buffalo Bills hat or Buffalo Bills shirt, they're going to gravitate toward that person. They're going to say, "Oh, we root for the same team." It's the same community that I'm trying to create here with the company of dads. If you see somebody who is a lead dad, or you meet somebody on one of our online meetups who's a lead dad, you're going to follow up with them later on. I can think of these two guys that I matched up in Kansas City. Turns out, they live in the same city. They're both lead dads. They wanted that community. So what we're trying to do is to help with the burnout, show people that what they're doing is actually being done by many more men than they think are doing it, that they're not alone in this task, and that they can have support. They can come to a community where they can ask a question about, how do you manage XYZ task, and get an answer from somebody who's actually doing it, not be made fun of for what they're doing.
So yeah, again, the intentionality and the awareness. You talked about having the conversations and the paper split test. To raise awareness with burnout. One of my frustrations is that it's become so common that people are just taking it as a normal state of affairs,
Mm.
and we're not looking at the cost to the individual in terms of their own pain and suffering, but also their effectiveness in whatever roles they're playing. And part of the challenge then is to raise awareness that yes, burnout has early stages, middle stages, late stages, when you literally can't go on anymore. Um, but that there's also things that can be done. And some of what you've talked about, with working with companies to give them grace.
I'd love to turn it around to you, Doc, because this would be something that'd be beneficial to, the community I'm building at the company of dads. When you have a parent, man or woman, doesn't really matter, but you have a parent who's coming to you and they're working and they're burned out. What are those stages? How do people know? Like, how would a lead dad know that he's burned out? How would he know that he's in the early stages or the late stages of that? I'd love to hear, your thoughts on that.
By the time someone comes to see me, Paul, the chances are that they're kind of late
Right.
stage.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So when burnout crosses over to I can't anymore, we were talking more about depression, but raising awareness of what are the signs of burnout, right? Exhaustion, right? You wake up and you're already depleted. Your attitude changes. This depletion leads to the bitterness, cynicism, resentments. The people in your life that are supposed to be the reason that you do things, they become a thorn in your side instead of, kind of your meaning and your purpose, and losing effectiveness. So as we have these dialogues, as I have these, podcasts and talk to other founders, CEOs, executives, we really kind of want to raise that awareness. If someone's not hit the point where they need to see me professionally, by the time they come to see me, we're typically, people come to see me because they want medications. They may not want medications, but they're here for medications. And we can give them lifestyle things that they can do, right? So sleep, move more, eat better, meditate, socialize. There's foundational things that people can do. And they're like, yeah. Which medication am I going to get
Right.
prescribed? Um, and we'll work with both, right? The kind of people have things that they can integrate into their lives. But if you're not to a point where medications are critical, there's some pillars, low-hanging fruit that are incredibly helpful to be thinking about.
But for example, don't leave us hanging there,
No,
Doc. Oh
no,
no,
very,
what's the low hanging fruit?
yeah. So, first there's the physical components. So physical components means kind of your body. So sleeping, exercise, eating well, mentally taking care of your psyche. One of the biggest things is unplugging from social media, and when I was burnt out and I was kind of clawing my way out, one of the biggest things I did was to turn off things that had a lot of negativity. And I love sports and I loved listening to sports radio, but sports radio in the morning had turned into just a torrent of negativity. Who was doing what that shouldn't have been doing this or that. So I put up blinders to the negative things and stopped giving that attention. I was super busy in my life, but having a support network of things that are positive. And what I found was that there was a podcast industry that I had never heard about, and that there was so much good stuff there. So I created, a world of virtual mentors, who, if you saw me and still today, I've got podcasts playing all the time. If I'm doing laundry, if, I'm in the car, like
Right.
there's a podcast going because, staying positive, maintaining yourself requires energy.
That's fascinating, Doc. I remember years ago, I was a reporter for the Financial Times, which is based in London. And a mentor of mine was this guy named Alistair Reed, who spent a lot of his career in South America and also in the DR. And he introduced me to this famous Cuban writer named Guillermo Cabrera Infante. And Guillermo Cabrera Infante won the Cervantes Prize. He was an incredible writer. And I would go and visit him when I was in London. One time I went over and he wasn't the same. And I said, Kim, are you okay? And he said, he was a very honest, open guy. I mean, he had escaped, Castro. And he said, I'm having a bout of depression. And I said, how do you know? And he said, well, I have this test that I do. And I said, okay. He says, I watch I Love Lucy. And if I don't laugh, then I know I'm depressed. And this guy was I don't know if you know, but he's a giant, a literary giant in the Spanish speaking world. And for him, again, the Cervantes Prize is like the Nobel Prize in the Spanish speaking world. And for him to have won the Cervantes Prize and then to watch something as lowbrow as I Love Lucy was hard. But he knew himself, like he knew, and then he knew what he had to do to help him get out of this. And I haven't thought of this in 20 years, but to think about it now, I think I wish that if fathers and mothers had some sort of trigger, as you said, like to help them, or they became more self aware so that before they got to the part where they had to come see you, before they were coming to see you, not to talk, but because they wanted you to prescribe something, they could have this trigger like, okay, what do I do with my family? What do I do with my job? Because I think too often there are all these stories that the free range childhood is over. There is a lot of anxiety around our children. There's certainly a lot of anxiety now around our careers. Everyone's wondering like, what's AI going to do? Is it going to replace all of us? Probably not, but it'll probably replace some of us. But that's anxiety provoking. And I remember, I don't know, back in 2000, probably when Mitt Romney was running for president. Um, I think he has like 5 kids, and somebody asked him like, "Boy, your kids have all, turned out really great. What did you do?" And he's not a very funny guy, and he said kind of deadpan, he said, "Well, I made a couple decisions and then I waited 20 years to see if they would work out." But that was a way, like, if we had that level of perspective to say like, okay, we're going to do the best we can at everything and give us give ourselves some grace.
One of the findings from the positive psychology movement, one of the founders was asked, like, what have we learned with all the positive psychology feedback? And he came back with other people matter. So keeping the supports, being vulnerable and authentic, and being able to speak of the things that are bothering you, and having a circle, may not be a lot of people, but having at least some people that you're connected with, right? The sense of connection is so critical in today's day and age.
One of the things we do at the company is just really we encourage people, and it's an overused word, but we encourage men to be vulnerable. But what we're really doing is bringing them together so that they can have a conversation and share, their experiences with other men who've chances are have had, you know, similar experiences. And I'm also, no shock that I'm on your podcast. I'm also somebody who, I believe that psychological pain is just as damaging, if not more so, than physical pain. And so I've always been super open about, talking to a therapist, but too many people are not. I think we've made a ton of progress since my childhood, 40 years ago to now. But how do you help people, moms and dads, say it is okay to have these conversations? It is okay to talk to these people about it. You don't just have to talk about the Buffalo Bills. You can talk about something that really matters to you.
And one of the things that I've done is to lead by example. So in my psychiatric practice, I mean, the standard of care is that we don't self-reveal, and there's very, very good reasons for that. But when I wrote my book, when I put on my coaching hat with clients, no, I'm pretty open about the fact that I've had problems with alcohol. I've had problems with depression. I've had problems with significant burnout. So I think that leaning into openness,
Mm,
especially when a position like yours or a position like mine, it gives people permission to open up themselves.
that's great. Yeah, I believe in that 100%. Like you're kind of leading by example. If you say like, hey, this is what I've been through, people are more apt to say, well, hey, I feel I can trust you, and let me share my experience with you as well.
And there's almost a pressure that people kind of feel that they finally have an outlet that someone understands, and it's okay to feel, it's okay to not be perfect. It's my anti-sizzle reel that I reveal. Yeah, and
I love that, the anti-sizzle reel.
I borrowed that from somebody.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, Paul, as we're finishing up, is there anything that you think is important for us to cover that we haven't covered?
I just want to encourage, talk my own book here for a second, but encourage men to reach out and to know that, the company dads is a resource for, all lead dads. We, when you sort of put your hand up and say, I'm a lead dad, it's something positive. And one of the things we did very early on was I got in touch with a couple NFL players who were retired who were lead dads, and they were super impactful in launching the movement that we're creating because there's nothing more masculine in America than a professional football player.
Yeah.
And there's this one guy, Najee Good. He played 10 years in the league for the Eagles, won a Super Bowl, sacked Tom Brady. I mean, he had an amazing career. And here he was, doing his little girl's hair. He had full custody of his kids. He was, a full on lead dad. And I want people to look at, models like that. The rest of us are not ever going to be NFL players, but to look at models like that and say, look, being a super involved father is a masculine thing to do. Being a provider does not mean only bringing home money. Being a provider means being there physically, being there psychologically, being there as a caregiver. And so, what we really want to work through at the company is to help people redefine a lot of the words that have been too often have pigeonholed men into doing, one thing. Provider means, I think we talked about at the beginning, that hunter gatherer phase. I'm going to go out and get something and bring it home. We want people to know that in 2026 to be provider is a much more expansive word, and it's going to be better for everybody. It's going to be better for your spouse, it's going to be better for you yourself, and it's going to be better for your kids when you can lean into that more expansive definition of being a provider and being masculine at the same time.
I love it, and I love the work that you're doing, Paul. Thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Yeah, thanks, Doc. You come to the companydads.com. So companydads.com, and we always say an easy way into all that we're doing is to sign up for our newsletter, The Dad. And so that's just the companydads.com/. The Dad comes out just once a week, so it won't clog up your inbox.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Doc. I appreciate it.